The whole world is witnessing what seemed impossible just a few decades ago. The UN, the ultimate symbol of peace and global stability, has entered a functional collapse. Created in 1945 after the Second World War, the institution was presented as the cornerstone of a new era, the guarantee that the horrors of the past would not be repeated. But in 2025, the truth is painful. The UN is paralyzed, powerless, and increasingly irrelevant in the face of crises erupting across every corner of the planet. In the latest Global Security Report, analysts did not mince words. The international architecture of the post-war era has crumbled. The Security Council, which should be the highest decision-making body, has turned into a stage of vetoes, where the particular interests of major powers block any attempt at collective response. While civil wars destroy entire countries and high-intensity conflicts threaten to pull in nuclear powers, the UN limits itself to empty speeches and resolutions that are never implemented. The most evident example is the Middle East. While Gaza sinks into catastrophic hunger and the civilian population faces alarming levels of violence, the UN cannot even approve a consistent humanitarian action. And this is not an isolated case. From Sudan to Myanmar, the organization's inability to act has become its trademark. The so-called post-Cold War era, once synonymous with relative stability and shared rules, is now remembered only as a period that ended without heirs. The UN has failed in its essential mission to prevent rivalries between powers from placing the world once again on the edge of the abyss. Instead of mediating, the institution was captured by the logic of vetoes, becoming hostage to those it was supposed to oversee. The result is an international order that can no longer sustain itself, fragmented between rival blocs, short-term interests, and the absence of effective coordination mechanisms. And here is the question that remains. If the UN no longer serves to maintain peace, who will take on that role? Have we entered definitively into an era without rules, where every power plays only for itself? Leave it in the comments. Do you believe the UN can still be saved? Or are we officially in a world without a referee? When we talk about the collapse of the UN, it is not rhetorical exaggeration. It is a practical reality. The heart of the institution, the Security Council, is today trapped by a rule created 80 years ago, the veto power of the 5 permanent members. What was meant to prevent unilateral abuses ended up becoming a mechanism of total blockage. Just one country saying no is enough to bury any resolution, regardless of whether millions of lives are at stake. This outdated mechanism explains why, even in the face of extreme violence, unprecedented humanitarian crises, and wars involving prohibited weapons, the UN remains silent or stuck in bureaucratic repetitions of deep concern. Speeches echo in the New York Hall, but in the trenches of Gaza, in the refugee camps of Sudan, or in the devastated villages of Myanmar, the reality is abandonment. The promise of never again has turned into nothing more than an empty slogan. And this weakening is not limited to military matters. Multilateral treaties on the environment, trade, and even human rights are being selectively ignored. Each power chooses what to respect and what to discard according to convenience. The result is an international system drained of meaning, where rules do not apply to everyone, and agreements only exist when they match the interests of the strongest. The report underlines, the conflict in Palestine is the clearest symbol of this breakdown. While adherence to international law is demanded from some, the West closes its eyes to the violations of others. This double standard has destroyed the UN's credibility and given strength to the discourse of the so-called Global South, which accuses the powers of hypocrisy. This scenario revives the memory of the spirit of Bandung of 1955, when African and Asian countries united to say, enough to the dominance of the great powers. We are therefore facing a UN incapable of leading, and a multilateralism that no longer exists. The era when institutions functioned as buffers between rivals is over. The global board is now played directly, without a referee and without clear rules, and this exponentially increases the risk of a mistake that could ignite the planet. For decades, it was believed that the international order created after the Cold War, with the UN as its central guardian, would be capable of preventing new global disasters. But what we see today is exactly the opposite. The system that was supposed to ensure stability has become irrelevant in the face of the rivalry of major powers. The report is clear. The era of shared rules is over, replaced by a transactional logic where each actor plays alone, without worrying about global consequences. This process did not happen overnight. The UN crisis is the result of years of negligence, selectivity, and inability to adapt. While the world was changing radically, with new powers emerging, technologies transforming the battlefield, and entire populations demanding a voice, the institution remained tied to the design of the 1940s. The outcome was predictable. It lost legitimacy. The numbers are striking. Since 2014, global peace has deteriorated year after year. Today, there are nearly 60 active state conflicts worldwide, most without any effective UN intervention. The Security Council meets, issues statements, but in practice, decisions are made by tanks, drones, and unilateral sanctions. The promise of collective governance has given way to the reality of every nation for itself. And the fragility of the UN is not only diplomatic, it is symbolic. If before the institution functioned as the great referee, today it is seen as a powerless spectator. For many countries of the global south, the UN is nothing more than a stage controlled by the global north, which dictates rules when convenient and looks the other way when it does not suit them. This perception fuels the search for alternatives outside the Western orbit, whether in regional forums or rival economic blocs. We are therefore facing a historic milestone. The UN has ceased to be the reference for legitimacy. The collapse of its credibility exposes the decline of the post-Cold War era, showing that international consensus is nothing more than a fiction. If before diplomacy passed through New York, today it is decided in rival capitals, in secret bilateral agreements or in veiled threats of confrontation. And I want to know your opinion. Is this collapse of the UN irreversible, or does the possibility of reform still exist to restore relevance to the institution? Leave it in the comments because this debate is central for the future of humanity. The collapse of the UN is not only an institutional crisis, but also proof that the world has changed and that the architecture created in 1945 did not keep pace. The Security Council was designed to reflect the balance of power of the Second World War, but in 2025 that arrangement seems like a museum piece. China has become the second largest economy on the planet. India has surpassed all others in population. New regional powers have gained ground. Yet the UN remains frozen in time, with the same 5 permanent members and the same absolute veto power. This anachronism undermines the legitimacy of the institution. How can African, Asian, and Latin American countries be expected to follow the decisions of a system in which they have no real voice? This exclusion feeds the silent rebellion of the so-called Global South, which prefers to create parallel forums rather than submit to a structure that treats them as mere spectators. The UN's decline is therefore also the decline of an era. The era of the Cold War and the post-Cold War, when it was believed there were universal rules, has come to an end. What remains now is a fragmented scenario, where each bloc seeks to impose its own norms. And in this game, there is no neutral referee. And I ask you, do you believe the UN should be reformed to include new powers in the Security Council, or is the institution already condemned to irrelevance? Leave your vision in the comments. The UN's impotence is also reflected in the humanitarian field. The most devastating crises of our time, Sudan, Gaza, Myanmar, reveal a cruel reality. The organization that was created to protect civilians can no longer guarantee even the basics. Agencies like the World Food Programme and UNHCR are on the verge of financial collapse, while the Security Council remains trapped in the game of vetoes and political disputes. This vacuum generates serious consequences. Without global coordination, aid depends on the goodwill of individual powers, which frequently use assistance as an instrument of influence. What should be a neutral and universal mission becomes a geopolitical bargaining chip. In the end, the price is paid by the millions of displaced, hungry, and forgotten people. Moreover, the UN space is being occupied by parallel actors. Regional groups, temporary alliances, and even private organizations take on tasks that once were the monopoly of the United Nations. But this process fragments the global order even further, creating overlaps and competitions that increase inefficiency. The system loses coherence and the planet loses predictability. The report is clear. The collapse of multilateralism has left a vacuum that no single actor can fill. Without a functional UN, the world is moving towards a scenario of constant improvisation, where crucial decisions are made at the last moment, in times of crisis, without legitimacy and without global coordination. The hollowing out of the UN also reveals a profound change in the way states view diplomacy. If in the past the institution functioned as the central stage where conflicts were negotiated, today the real decisions take place elsewhere. Bilateral meetings, regional summits, or even informal platforms dominated by the major powers. For many leaders, the UN has become merely a space for symbolic speeches, useful for image but without practical effect. This shift further undermines the relevance of the organization. The less countries believe in the UN's capacity, the less they invest in its initiatives, and the fewer resources the institution has, the less it can act, creating a vicious circle of irrelevance. The consequence is clear. Crises that previously would have had at least an attempt at international mediation now proceed unchecked, paving the way for humanitarian tragedies and escalation risks. The report highlights that this weakening is not only circumstantial, but structural. The world order based on common rules is being replaced by an order of immediate transactions, of short-term bargains. Instead of consensus, the logic of force and influence prevails. The UN, which was supposed to be the referee, has become a spectator. If the Cold War was marked by a bipolar system, and the post-Cold War by a brief unipolar moment, what we live through now is something new, a fragmented multipolar world, but without mechanisms of coordination. And in this scenario, the UN has found no space to reinvent itself. What the report exposes is more than an administrative flaw. It is the collapse of a model. The UN, which was born to be the global referee, has become irrelevant at the very moment the world most needs a mediator. And this vacuum is dangerous. Without a reliable instance of mediation, any local crisis can turn into a regional firestorm and, quickly, into a global threat. The consequences are already here. The multilateralism that once served as a brake on unilateral ventures has been replaced by an open dispute between power blocs. This means that, in practice, there are no longer universal rules. Each power acts according to its own interests, and when those interests clash, there is no referee to prevent escalation. The risk of miscalculation, provocation, or even a larger conflict has never been so high since the Second World War. The collapse of the UN is therefore not only symbolic, it marks the definitive transition to a world in which peace depends less on institutions and more on brute force, economics, and technology. The post-Cold War order is dead, and the future will be disputed in new arenas, often beyond the reach of international law. And now I want to know from you, do you believe there is still room for a reform that restores relevance to the UN? Or are we entering an era without a referee where instability will become the new rule? Leave your comment because your opinion is part of this global debate.